Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the International Security Speaker Series, co-sponsored by the Robert Strauss Center on International Security and Law and the LBJ Presidential Library. Very pleased to have you all here and see you tonight. My name is Eugene Goltz. I'm a professor at the LBJ School, and I organize the series. I'd like to, of course, thank our sponsors from the Strauss Center and from the library, and it's always fun to point out our sponsors. Mark, you were in the back of the room. There he is, Mark Updegrove, the director of the library. Thank you for offering us the great room and co-sponsoring the series. We're very pleased to have it. It's my great pleasure tonight to have Julian Zelizer here as our speaker. Julian is a professor at Princeton, a historian by training, but he chooses to live in the real world in that instead of completely wallowing in the distant past, he studies contemporary events or relatively contemporary events, the Cold War and presidents, and kind of important things that have implications for the world today, the world around us. And he's a very dynamic person, and he manages also to be dynamic in a very public sphere. So I actually hadn't realized this until I was talking with him earlier today. He writes a column every week for CNN, not just occasionally. He's very, very engaged, and he frequently writes in the Washington Post or the New York Times or Politico or other of those kind of newfangled, interneted up ways of connecting to the world. So very impressive for a historian. And on top of all that, he actually has real credentials. Like he's a top-notch scholar, which he brings to that contemporary perspective. And tonight we're going to hear about his recent book. I brought a copy, The Arsenal of Democracy. Hefty. So by the weight criteria, he's doing okay. But actually, if you read it, extremely engaging. Like, you could fly through this book and learn a lot. And today, I think he's going to help us hit the highlights, and that will maybe whet your appetite even more about the arsenal of democracy. The subtitle is The Politics of National Security from World War II to the War on Terrorism. It's a really interesting study of the role of politics and political debates within the United States that kind of prevents the maxim that politics should stop at the water's edge from actually fully coming to fruition in the United States. The political controversies that really dictate our foreign policy during the Cold War and since. And I'm really interested in where the fascinating discussion will take us. So Julian, please.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm going to take the podium. Thank you for having me. It's really, this is one of my favorite places to visit. I appreciate the invitation to be both at the school and at the museum and archive. I've been here many times in the research room. I'll be back this summer. And it's really, always an exciting visit to Austin. So thank you for having me. During the 6 decades since the creation of America's national security state during World War II and the early Cold War, politics never stopped at the water's edge. Too often there's a nostalgia that the kind of fierce political battles over national security, which we see today, such as the instant Republican criticism of President Obama following the failed Christmas bombing, or Democratic criticism of President Bush in the post-9/11 period, that it's much different than what has taken place in the past. There's a nostalgia for periods like the 1940s when there is a perception that individuals such as Senator Arthur Vandenberg of Michigan was able to work with President Harry Truman in the kind of alliance that is almost unimaginable today. It was Vandenberg who coined the term that politics stops at the water's edge. But these memories only capture brief moments in modern American political history. And the book that I have written seeks to shatter the myth, saying that since the creation of our modern national security state, national security has always been an issue in domestic political struggles, and national security policymaking has always taken place within a very heated political context. The book provides a narrative history of how this happened and what the implications were for national security. The stories of key moments do keep coming back to four central questions that I think are recurring throughout this period. One is the balance between executive and legislative power. A second is which party has the national security advantage when it comes to the ballot box. A third are the struggles and debates over how big our government should be and what the limits are of growing the government to protect the home front. And finally, the ongoing debates between unilateralism and multilateralism in our international policy. One of the interesting aspects of the narrative for me, just as I put together the book, was to understand how different presidents and different legislators responded to the political pressures that they inevitably face. And today I wanted to talk about one of the chapters and one of the stories in the book, and that's the Cuban Missile Crisis from 1962, a period where historians have traditionally downplayed the political environment within which President Kennedy and his administration had to make those critical decisions. And in this case, the ways in which President Kennedy was able to ultimately resist some of the political pressures that he faced. Kennedy was part of a generation of Democrats who came of professional age during the 1950s and who were always extraordinarily nervous about what Republicans might do on the question of anti-communism. During the 1950s, and I write about this in the book, a group of Republicans helped the party to regain ground on national security after World War II, when it had been Democrats who had led the nation to a victorious war. Republicans after World War II focused on a series of issues to recover some of their own political strength. Those include the fall of China to communism in 1949, the threat of communist spies here in the United States as embodied by the McCarthyite scare, and the stalemate in Korea in 1951 and 1952. For many Democrats, the 1952 election was extraordinarily important. I always think it's kind of one of the downplayed elections in American politics. And for many Democrats, Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson, that 1952 election scarred them as they watched Republicans really decimate both Adlai Stevenson and congressional Democrats, taking control of both the White House and Congress and using national security very effectively to counteract Democratic attacks. From the start of John F. Kennedy's administration in 1961, the Republican right worked hard to undercut Kennedy's appeal on national security. Anti-communism during this period was the glue that held conservative organizations together. The failed invasion of Cuba with the Bay of Pigs seemed to offer proof to conservatives that, in fact, President Kennedy could not be trusted to handle national security issues. Senator Thurston Morton said that the invasion had been disastrous. Other Republicans pointed to this as evidence that all the claims they had been making since 1952 were true. Kennedy was losing some of the luster of his campaign. James Reston wrote the following: "He was like a young prize fighter, toying gracefully with his opponent, jabbing at will and casually waving to the crowd, when suddenly he was clipped on the chin. The magic of the first 2 months had vanished." Although most accounts of the Cuban Missile Crisis begin in the middle of October of 1962, the famous moment when President Kennedy is shown the photographs of Soviet missile installations. The story actually begins in July and August of 1962, when congressional Republicans, in preparation for the midterm elections, are attacking the president for not responding to a Soviet buildup of military force in Cuba. The buildup, as we know, had begun by June of 1962, as Nikita Khrushchev had begun to deploy missiles, anti-aircraft batteries, military and technical personnel for various objectives, including deterring another invasion of Cuba, as well as improving the Soviet negotiating hand over the question of Berlin. There were some early warning signs before the summer that something was going on. The Miami News publishes a story in the late spring of 1962 about plans for the Soviets to build some kind of military site in Cuba. South Carolina Democrat Mendel Rivers of the House Armed Services Committee warns in June, he warns CIA Director John McCone that 4 intermediate-range ballistic missile bases are being prepared in Cuba. The president is concerned early in that summer that these kinds of rumors could hurt the Democrats in the midterm elections. The summer of 1962 is shaping up to be a very difficult summer for the administration. The economy is starting to slow down, just as tensions over civil rights are starting to heat up. Congress is stalling on one of the main domestic proposals of the administration, health care for the aged, which Ways and Means Chairman Wilbur Mills has locked up in his committee. Kennedy is concerned about what's going to happen in those midterm elections, and as all of us who've studied the period remember and know, his concern isn't that Democrats are going to lose control of Congress, but that the size of the conservative coalition, the coalition of Southern Democrats and Republicans, would expand. And by the summer of '62, it had become clear to Kennedy that most of his domestic agenda was being held hostage by this coalition, which controlled most of the major committees. On August 5th, a U-2 reconnaissance flight discovers evidence of Soviet military equipment going into Cuba. Kennedy does acknowledge that there is proof that the Soviets are sending material to Cuba, but he says repeatedly that there is no sign either of any troop movements or the placement of offensive weapons, which he says is what the United States needs to be scared of. Meaning, if they are weapons that could shoot things down, that is not a top threat or concern to the administration. But if there was evidence of offensive weapons, that would be something different. Throughout August of 1962, 2 senators take the lead in attacking the president. One is Senator Ken Keating of New York, who is a liberal on domestic policy, including civil rights, but is trying to shore up his credentials with the party by stressing his anti-communist credentials. Keating had been elected in 1958, and he believes this is a way, again, in which he can show that, yes, he actually is conservative on key national issues. The other person who is attacking President Kennedy is Homer Capehart, who is a very different kind of Republican than Keating. He is a diehard conservative. He had been an opponent of FDR and President Truman's domestic policies. He had been an isolationist through the 1940s, but he had changed during the early Cold War, supporting the Marshall Plan and the creation of the United Nations. As like many Republicans, he moderated his stances. He had been one of the chief critics of Kennedy following the Bay of Pigs. Although all the information from the informants and the CIA remained classified at this time, Keating and Capehart kept this issue in the public. Keating liked to ridicule Kennedy's distinction between offensive and defensive weapons by saying, "Who is to say whether a weapon is offensive or defensive? It depends on the direction in which it is aimed." Concern about his Republican opponents, inside and outside the administration, the president is very cautious in August to make sure that all classified information is withheld from the public, because Kennedy argues if this is leaked to the media, it will turn into more fodder for his Republican opponents, and it will in fact make things difficult to resolve should a crisis emerge. Because he doesn't think the information reveals any serious threat, he doesn't feel any need to share what's going on with the public. The administration understood that it was facing, though, a serious political challenge. Assistant Secretary of State Robert Manning warns McGeorge Bundy that, quote, in the public mind, missiles are missiles, and the presence of anything that could be termed missile installations in Cuba is certain to have a heavy psychological impact on the American public and on public opinion in the hemisphere and elsewhere. Kennedy tells Dean Rusk and Bundy that he needed to calm the political storms, so he asked them to have the leadership down here, the Republicans, key gas bags, and others, so that he could update them on information and avoid charges that he is trying to cover something up. On September 4th, President Kennedy meets with a bipartisan group of legislators. Kennedy assures the legislators once again these are not offensive weapons. Senator Richard Russell, a Georgia senator, a powerhouse in the Senate who had mentored Lyndon Johnson, responds that the Cubans could use every bit of this stuff into offensive use. Kennedy issues a public statement in early September saying that the United States would use whatever means necessary to prevent Soviet aggression. Kennedy, his responses don't satisfy the Republicans. Barry Goldwater, senator from Arizona who's contemplating a run for the 1964 presidential campaign, said that, quote, the American people will not be satisfied with the president's reiteration of a do-nothing policy toward Cuba. Majority Leader Mike Mansfield tells the president that in the Senate Majority Policy Committee, there was a great deal of concern over the, quote, domestic political implications of the situation in Cuba. At one of their most recent meetings, Mike Mansfield said, Democrats discussed a wide range of action. He said there was some talk that those Democrats running for re-election in November would have to leave you on this matter unless something were done. If public pressures on Democratic members now begin to lead them to engage in an attempt to outdo Republicans in militancy on Cuba, Mansfield said, I am concerned as to where this might all end. On October 7th, Senate Minority Leader Everett Dirksen said Kennedy had a sorry record on Cuba. There's a mess in Cuba, Dirksen said, a mess of our own making that began with the New Frontier. On October 10th, a few days later, Senator Keating followed up by offering the most specific attack to that point when he said he had fully confirmed through his sources that construction has begun on at least 6 launching sites for intermediate range tactical missiles. Keating's speech disturbed Kennedy very much because it contained a level of specificity that had been absent from most of the attacks until that point. Keating's word, according to one senior CIA official, hit like a bombshell at the White House and infuriated Kennedy. Kennedy tried to get to the senator's sources to figure out where he was getting his information from. John McCone met with Keating and he asks him to lay his cards on the table. Keating refuses to do so, and the meeting disintegrates into an ugly verbal fight. A second meeting was scheduled, but Keating doesn't show up. On the day Keating delivers his speech, McCone had shown Kennedy photographs of Soviet ships that were carrying crates toward Cuba, which his advisors believed might contain offensive weapon material. The president requested that this information be withheld, as he had done before, because he says if this information gets into the press, the issue would be a more violent issue, he says, that would be very hard to control. During a speech in Boston, right after Kennedy had seen this information, former President Dwight Eisenhower said that Kennedy had a dreary foreign policy record of the past 21 months. And many people saw Eisenhower's speech as a signal to other Republicans that Cuba and foreign policy was, in fact, a legitimate issue in these midterm elections. And then the floodgates opened. On the morning of October 16th, the CIA showed the president the first hard evidence in the form of aerial photographs of offensive missile sites in Cuba. According to presidential advisor Kenny O'Donnell, Kennedy approached him that morning after he had seen the pictures, and he asked O'Donnell if he thought that all the fuss about Cuba was still politically unimportant. Absolutely, O'Donnell said, as he assured Kennedy that voters won't give a damn about Cuba come November. Kennedy then showed him the photographs. After inspecting the pictures with a magnifying glass, O'Donnell said he couldn't believe his eyes. "You'd better believe it," Kennedy replied. "We've just elected Capehart in Indiana, and Ken Keating will probably be the next president of the United States." The final photographs were in fact given to the president at the very same time that the Republican National Committee, the same day that the RNC announced that the main issue of the final 2 weeks of the campaign would be Cuba. RNC Chairman William Miller, who later runs with Barry Goldwater in 1964, issues a statement on October 16th endorsed by Senator Goldwater and California Representative Robert Wilson, saying, "We are distressed to note that administration spokesmen in their campaign speeches have studiously avoided forthright discussion of foreign policy." They said if we were asked to state the issue in one word, that word would be Cuba, a symbol for the tragic irresolution of the administration. By October 18th, Cuba had emerged as a top campaign issue in a poll of congressmen and reporters. Out of 344 editors, about 301, I think, selected Cuba as the top issue for the final 2 weeks. 155 out of 208 legislators who were surveyed responded with the same choice. While the photographs that Kennedy saw remained a top secret, the president faced tremendous pressure from members of his own inner circle of advisors to authorize a military strike or some kind of invasion. During one meeting of ExComm, the top secret group of advisors that guides the president during this crisis, a Republican advocate of an airstrike, Douglas Dillon, Secretary of Treasury, slipped speechwriter and advisor Ted Sorensen a note. It says, "Ted, have you considered the very real possibility that if we allow Cuba to complete installation and operational readiness of missile bases, the next House of Representatives is likely to have a Republican majority?" But Kennedy resists the pressure to respond with military force as he deliberates over whether to impose a quarantine or a blockade or to authorize a military strike. The president does continue to think about the political repercussions of the missiles. In the context of the past month, the crisis threatened to undermine much of the momentum the Democrats had regained by 1960 after that devastating 1952 election when President Eisenhower defeated Adlai Stevenson, who was tied down by Truman's reputation on communism, Korea, and China, through the missile gap debates and attacks that Eisenhower had in fact undermined America's security by trying to balance the budget by cutting defense. After one meeting about missiles, Kennedy spoke with RFK and Ted Sorensen on the Truman balcony and said the crisis could easily harm Democrats since Republicans would say they had been right all along. Kennedy feared that too aggressive of a stand could also open up Democrats to another familiar refrain from Republicans, that Democrats were in fact the war party in this country. Notwithstanding his fears, what becomes clear through the archives is that Kennedy does resist the temptation to make a political issue out of the crisis. The minutes of the ex-con meetings reveal very few discussions, at least, about political considerations as Kennedy and his staff talk over the options. Even when the president still is on the campaign trail before he pulls off during this period, he doesn't talk about Cuba. Kennedy decides to announce a quarantine with the warning that there would be tougher action if the Soviets violate it. Anticipating Republican attacks once the photographs become public, he instructs John McCone to update Dwight Eisenhower and to seek his assistance. On October 21st, Eisenhower delivers a speech in which he now states, in contrast to the earlier speech, that any foreign policy crisis should not be part of the campaign. On October 22nd, though, thousands of conservatives rally at Madison Square Garden to attack the administration. The audience includes such luminaries as William Buckley and Frank Meyer. When one speaker says that by doing nothing, Kennedy was being a silent partner in tyranny, the crowd booed the president and cheered speakers who were calling for an invasion of Cuba, chanting, "Fight, fight," on the floor of the garden. Later that evening, Kennedy goes on television and makes his famous speech where he announces the quarantine. The president announces that it will begin the next morning and there'll be more aggressive action if the buildup continues. Vice President Johnson reports to the president that legislators who spoke to him after the talk were quite pleased with what he had said. As the news unfolds, Americans watch their television sets as Soviet ships approach the U.S. quarantine. Many legislators asked the leadership if they could return home with their families, as many Americans plan how they could evacuate from the cities in case of a nuclear war. Republicans promise, verbally, to leave the issue out of the campaign after Kennedy has made his televised speech. According to Arthur Kroc of the New York Times, quote, "The issue which the Republicans sought to make paramount in the 1962 congressional campaign was that President Kennedy had failed to do something about the transformation of Cuba into a Soviet missile base. Hence, Kroc wrote, the issue is now dead. The president has killed it Monday night by doing something, indeed by an act which by its nature assured the unified support of the American people." Yet the attacks don't actually stop. Missouri Republican Thomas Curtis, a member of the Ways and Means Committee, described the confrontation as phony and contrived for election purposes. There was even a group of protesters on the right who staged a small event outside the White House carrying signs that read, "Appeasement is for cowards," and "Damn the missiles, full speed ahead." Meanwhile, Washington was buzzing with speculation during these weeks as to how the United States had missed this intelligence and why Senator Keating seemed to know more than President Kennedy about what was going on in Cuba. "The questions," one reporter wrote, "are being heard at diplomatic receptions, at Washington cocktail parties, and on homebound buses filled with government officials." Both JFK and RFK privately acknowledged that they were vulnerable to these kinds of attacks. After another ex-con meeting on October 23rd, Attorney General Robert Kennedy said, "What we are doing now is in fact closing the barn door after the horse is gone." Americans breathe a bit more easily when the Pentagon announces that all but a few of the Soviet ships that were heading toward Cuba had turned around. At the same time, UN Ambassador Adlai Stevenson famously humiliates the Soviets by revealing photographs of the sites right after the Soviets had denied that they existed. The crisis itself concludes with an exchange of letters between October 26th and 27th between Khrushchev and Kennedy, culminating in the deal whereby the United States pledges not to invade Cuba and secretly to remove missiles from Turkey down the road, and Khrushchev ends the buildup that had been taking place. Commenting on the politics of the situation after the resolution, Tom Wicker wrote in the New York Times, since 1952, when the frustration of the Korean War stalemate gave the Republicans the opening for attacking on this line, they have persistently pictured themselves as the party that knew best how to deal with communists. Now, having gone as near the brink of war as the Republican administration of Dwight Eisenhower ever did, with dramatic results, Mr. Kennedy and his party should have gone a long way toward scorching this recurrent issue against them. But it doesn't take long for the politics to come back. Eisenhower immediately boasts that Republicans deserved the credit for having pushed Kennedy to take a stand on this issue. On November 1st, Senator Goldwater and Representative Wilson tell reporters that the president should answer 8 questions about Cuba, including whether the no guarantee meant that the United States had accepted the permanence of communism in Cuba and whether it would now abandon Cuban refugees seeking to overthrow Castro. On a Sunday morning talk show, Keating appears and says that he was just baffled why the administration had denied the charges that he was making in September and early October when he says they knew the information was true. The attacks don't work in the short term. The editors of the Wall Street Journal write, Republicans may argue that the blockade was too little and too late, but they can no longer contend that Mr. Kennedy did nothing or is not succeeding so far. The midterm elections are seen generally as a success for the Democratic Party. Democrats expand their numbers in the Senate by 2 seats and only lose 4 House seats, which by the standards of midterm elections early in a presidency is not bad. Some of Kennedy's top critics on this issue lose their seats, including Walter Judd as well as Senator Capehart. Richard Nixon had also made a big issue of this while running in the gubernatorial campaign in California, and many argued that this had undercut him as well. There were obviously many factors at play in those midterm elections, but most agreed that the resolution of Cuba had been part of the Democratic success. If the president was running for office in this campaign, he'd even carry Maine and Vermont, said one Democrat, of those then rock-ribbed Republican states. The battles would continue over this issue. In 1963, Republicans charged that the administration had covered up or ignored CIA warnings while failing to authorize U-2 flights over Cuba in September. Keating charged that while McCone had provided shocking data to the president in October and September, our government kept busy denying everything. Gerald Ford, who was the House Republican Conference Chair, said in early 1963 that the whole situation has a peculiar odor. Reporters started to call this the photo gap or the picture gap scandal, talking both about why the president hadn't responded to the evidence, but why there had been a pause in U-2 flights as these allegations were being made in September. Republicans, along with some Southern Democrats, would also argue in 1963 that there was another Soviet buildup taking place in Cuba that once again the administration was denying. I don't think the people of the United States have been told all the facts, Keating said. I don't think that Congress has sufficient knowledge of the facts as a whole. Robert McNamara would even go on primetime television and interrupt various shows, including the Three Stooges, to show evidence that the new charges in 1963 were not true. The Cuban Missile Crisis is just one of the stories that I recount in the book. There are others where politicians don't respond successfully to some of the political pressures they face, including LBJ and Vietnam, as well as failed political efforts such as Gerald Ford's effort to protect the policy of détente against Republican attacks and neoconservative attacks in 1975 and 1976. But the book just tries to provide a history showing how this relationship between politics and national security is nothing new. From the time of World War II, we can see how American politicians have struggled to balance the conflicting demands of democracy and superpower status. The challenge became much more intense after the 1940s because America has created permanent national security institutions and accepted a permanent commitment overseas, ensuring that these issues would always remain central to our political debate. Even when the nation is not involved in war, political opponents have rarely hesitated about debating the question of what constitutes the best policies for the nation to pursue, and they've been willing to use national security to distinguish themselves from their opponents. The stories in the book provide an account that is different than the more quasi-conspiratorial arguments about how interest groups dominate the entire process, or arguments about how military elites are able to operate behind closed doors and basically shape the decisions of the nation. I look at a variety of different kinds of political pressures that take place during this period: ideological, electoral, and institutional. Politicians have faced multiple kinds of pressures when dealing with these threats, and at the same time, national security has influenced different components of domestic politics, ranging from the ideologies that parties have presented to voters to the actual outcome of certain elections. I hope that readers of the history in this book come away with a better understanding both of the dangers that have stemmed from this relationship, as well as some of the beneficial aspects that can come from having national security subject to political debate. This is a history that I like to write, as Eugene says, that does not come to an end, but that tries to raise questions and lessons for the next generation of policymakers who will certainly have to try to balance these two competing demands in our political system. Thank you.
Great. Thanks very much, Julian. That was for a very dynamic talk. And we have a good slug of time for questions because you were prompt as well. See, good speakers all around. So open the floor and try not to hog it myself. So somebody take it away from me. Jamie.
I have a couple of very specific questions and then a broader one. On Cuba, do we now know what Keating's sources were? And secondly, 2 years later, Bobby Kennedy brought an end to Keating's career, and I'm wondering whether Kennedy's choice to run in New York, obviously limited by the number of seats that are available, but was there an element of political revenge involved in that particular decision?
Broader
question.
Oh, yeah.
It's a much broader question on the whole book. Is it a fair proposition that Democrats are more supportive of Republican presidents than Republicans of Democratic presidents?
Okay. On the specifics, there was this article by a couple historians who tried to dig to find where did he get his sources, and they didn't find it conclusively. The two sources that they concluded he received it from, one were Cuban refugees, which at the time was what Kennedy thought, but also Claire Luce Booth, who was prominent in conservative circles during this time. I can't remember, to be honest, what the evidence was that they found, but they thought that she had also been giving this, also, though, based on informants that she had among Cuban refugees. That's the answer on Keating. That's all that's known. They didn't end it satisfactorily in their own minds, according to where he got it. The second one on Kennedy, I don't know. I mean, I don't think Robert Kennedy picked New York kind of for payback for Keating and this. I mean, I do think there was residue of animosity between the administration, between Robert Kennedy, who, he remembered things, and what Keating had done. But I haven't seen evidence that's in fact why New York is picked. Democrats can be pretty tough on Republican presidents, I would say. It's hard to say, is one party tougher than the other? So in the late 1950s, I have a chapter on kind of the origins of the missile gap debate. And, that comes out of Stuart Simonton and Kennedy and Henry Scoop Jackson of Washington and Lyndon Johnson, who really, take on Eisenhower on this issue. That his kind of passion for balancing the budget and his efforts to really streamline the military were undercutting U.S. strength. And when Sputnik happens, one of the remarkable things to reread on Sputnik was how it was seen and used as a national security issue. They said, aha, you see the Soviets are in fact advancing because this budget balancer is not spending enough on these kinds of systems. Eisenhower, of course, was deeply frustrated, thought it was totally unfair. He said this isn't true. He has U-2 flights that can confirm it's not true, that the Soviets have an advantage, but he can't admit it because that's all top secret. And he's very resentful of Democrats. And that's part of the famous speech on the military-industrial complex. It's not simply kind of an intellectual exercise. It comes out of deep political frustration with how Democrats had used this issue, culminating in '60 and the missile gap argument that Kennedy uses. There's other examples. Another is obviously, again, it's not the Democratic Party, but it's the Henry Scoop Jackson wing of the party on détente under Nixon and Ford, quite hard on him, using the issue of Soviet Jewry to really go after the Republican Party. Kissinger just hates Jackson. I mean, just vicious discussions about Henry Jackson, the Jewish community, because Jackson was using that question to undermine the legitimacy of détente. Democrats, I think, were pretty tough on Reagan. I mean, we forget. Again, it depends. Are you talking about kind of unfair arguments and attacks versus just being tough on him? But certainly Reagan feels quite constrained by the second and third year of his administration through kind of those behind the Bolin amendments, even through the nuclear freeze movement and the Democrats who support it. So I think Democrats have a tougher record or a more responsive record against Republican presidents than we often remember.
Please.
The Cuban invasion, any studies of how colossally, what a failure that was and why?
There are studies, and probably some of the people around this room have read every single one, about kind of what went wrong and the bad planning to the logistics of the effort, to Kennedy, getting ultimately duped by his security officials. Again, that's not the kind of center of my book, but there are a lot of studies of what went wrong. But politically, it was quite a problem for the presidency. And I had that quote, which reflected what a lot of people were saying. Kennedy is frustrated, A, because of the strategic incompetence of how the operation was carried off, and feeling that he didn't have a full range of advice over how this would work. But B, it put him in a horrible political situation. And it's not just a cynical argument that Kennedy's like, I'm going to lose seats. But his strength to deal with national security issues was undermined because of that invasion. So Kennedy is incredibly frustrated with the outcome of that. And many have argued that will then shape him to be less trustful of military advisors, CIA officials in the Cuban crisis. One interesting little side bit is a lot of Kennedy's advisors don't trust John McCone because he's a Republican. He had been brought in to reform the CIA. And many think he's the one within the government who is sending memos, and you can see them in the library, warning something's going on in Cuba. Just really fascinating memos if you're kind of a cultural historian. Very vivid description of the physical nature of the people, of the men coming in, kind of trying to ascertain whether they are soldiers or what kind of a threat. But they don't trust McCone because they think he's trying to ramp up fear in the administration because he's a Republican hawk. And in fact, McCone then goes on his, I don't remember the exact story, it's in the book, he goes on his honeymoon to France right in, I think it's late August or early September. And that's when Kennedy starts to try to bring in other advice to figure out, if what McCone has been saying is true or not. So there's all kinds of ramifications, and there are all kinds of studies that you can look up on that issue.
I've always thought that one of the key, in fact, the key issue of Cold War history was the United States' wholesale recruitment of war criminals after the Second World War. The Unit 731 Japanese, who were all given a pass for their war crimes, and the various Nazis, including and not limited to Einsatzgruppen commanding generals who were brought over to the United States and given citizenship. And at what level in the political system was that decision made? Have you ever looked into that? And does that show that there's something terribly wrong or some deficiency in the political system, that decisions like that can be made and not brought into the realm of open politics, even to this day? And do you think that that's a question historians will ever be able to get the answers to?
There's all kinds of questions that come out of the Cold War period involving alliances or contacts with war criminals or authoritarian governments who we ally with. They're not the centerpiece of what I write about. I mean, the issue comes in, but in terms of how those decisions are made and where they are made, there is a kind of voluminous literature on those kinds of questions. Will historians be able to get it? Sure. There's one site I would recommend, which is terrific, is the National Security Archive. I don't know if people have seen this. It's an online archive that covers a wide range of issues, including U.S. involvement in Chile, for example, or with Iran, where the documents are now being made available to people. It's a pretty astounding site. So I do think historians will get close to those, but there are important issues.
Come out to say whether or not Truman signed off on the amnesty for the Unit 731 criminals.
You'll have to ask another expert on that one.
Eisenhower know that his Nazi general officer in the death execution machine were brought over here in the United States with U.S. citizenship?
Maybe we'll try to have a talk about that another time, but we don't have that talk today. So, Josh.
I think your analysis provides a useful antidote to the sort of misperceptions, or at least the sort of conventional wisdom that politics did stop at the water's edge in the early Cold War years. But I guess the question I'd ask you is if is there any variation to the degree to which politics on foreign policy has been politicized over the years? Because it seems like it's an undifferentiated story, as if it has always been one way, but it seems like there could be, okay, yes, it was politicized, but not nearly as much as it has become with the, if you look at Peter Trubowitz's work on the degree of bipartisanship in voting in the early Cold War years compared to more contemporary era after de-alignment and after Vietnam. And so I wonder, I haven't read the books, I don't know where the rest of the chapters go, but do you have some sense of flux over time?
Here, I'll give you a historian's answer, yes and no. On the no part, I do kind of refrain from, I don't want to downplay too much the ferocity of the kind of political fights that you have in earlier periods, and that everything got worse post 9/11 kind of attacks. I mean, I think in fact, if you look back at the early Cold War period, the intensity of the fights, the intensity of the rhetoric and the accusations in some ways was much greater than today. You have accusations that State Department officials are essentially involved with treason. You have very vicious attacks on Atchison and Truman. In 1950, in the midterm campaign, the Democrats really play up the isolationism of the Republican Party, which wasn't always true and frustrated many Republicans. But the McCarthyite attacks, in some ways make Cheney look pretty calm in terms of what he's saying. So that's the no part. Just I want to kind of recover. And again, that's a historian's privilege to really just focus on recovering the stories and the language and that rhetoric that I do think is downplayed. I mean, when Vandenberg coins that term, it's in 52. It's in one of the kind of worst periods in terms of what the parties are willing to say about one another. Nixon's calling Adlai Stevenson Adlai the appeaser in public. That's pretty tough stuff. On the other hand, there are kind of secular changes that take place in American politics that affect national security. So there are more moments of bipartisanship and bipartisan alliances before the 1970s and after the 1970s. The trend I've studied in domestic policy in Congress, I think, holds true. You don't have as many moments anymore where you could find the other party kind of bringing along 20, 25 senators to vote for something. They become fewer, far and fewer, because of all the changes of polarization in American politics that we have studied. Kind of, you know, if there is an Everett Dirksen in contemporary politics, he will be able to bring along his own vote. That's bipartisanship today. Rather than saying Dirksen can bring over a group of Republican voters, or Vandenberg in 47 and 48. But even Vandenberg, again, what I just want to argue is that's not necessarily normative. I mean, in some ways, the bipartisanship is more impressive back then because the other fighting was equally as powerful. Another secular change is the media. I think that has definitely, you know, the kind of impact of the 24-hour media in two ways has been important. One, I do think, as I've written again in other books, it does facilitate the partisan conflict, much easier for the parties to disseminate information, to much harder to control information before it hits the media. It's also diminished the level of insularity that can exist, I think, in policymaking. You could say that's good or bad. But one of the things that's always remarkable is if you go back to 64 and 65, when we have these wonderful tapes from here, we now know that it wasn't a kind of domino theory that just swept all the advisors into Vietnam. And there was a big debate going on behind closed doors with people like Richard Russell telling Johnson this isn't a great war, it's not a good idea. And George Smathers telling Johnson, you know, I'm going up and down Capitol Hill and I can't find anyone who wants to go into this thing. But what's remarkable is we learned about that through the tapes. And you could read the newspapers of the period and not find almost any reporting. Fast forward to Afghanistan a few months ago, you pretty much heard in real time the debates going on in the White House with Biden opposing it and Clinton supporting it. I mean, you could literally get the whole thing. So I do think that's another kind of change. So there are those changes, but at the same time, I don't want to downplay those kind of fights.
I'm going to be a little unfair. I want to inject a question about the fights, and there are a couple other questions out there. I know we'll get to them. But we're treating politicization. The clear implication of your talk is that we should be more comfortable if politics did stop at the water's edge. Like we could figure out the right foreign policy and do it. And the fact that there's vitriolic politics debating national security policy is bad for the United States. That, you know, these people are making crazy allegations of treason, and sometimes it does get out of hand. And in your response, actually, to both Jamie and Josh, you brought up, you actually were making some distinctions between political comments that were sort of legitimate or illegitimate, or, you know, based on some, actually we know something, there's actually some intelligence here that we're bringing to light, or some facts that you don't know and we're criticizing you for the facts, seems more legitimate than just making stuff up. Or there's a whole other kind of debate, which I don't think you've discussed very much, which is about how to react to facts. Like people could have, we have a democratic process that allows us to determine if the facts don't dictate what the right outcome is, you know, what the right policy choice is. Well, what policy should we choose? What should we do? Because there are, you know, some people are willing to accept more risks than others. Some people are more interested in hunkering down in security even at all costs, and other people see more balances in the world. And I guess I'm trying to understand the implication of when is it bad to have these vitriolic politics, and when is it good to have these vitriolic politics? Because it seems to me that, in this particular case of Cuba, Keating actually, surprisingly, for some reason, knew something, and we should be darn glad that somebody's shaking things up, right? I mean, isn't that a good? So how do you figure that out? How do you sort that out?
That's good. I don't sort it out. That isn't. I mean, I gave a talk about this. I can't even remember where. I think it was to Princeton alumni or something, and someone came up and said, Kennedy really, doesn't sound so good in your talk, and he kind of blew it. And Keating was actually right, or he was on to something. So I mean, I don't. This isn't a book, and I know this frustrates some political scientists, and it will, that has kind of the A, B, and C implications of this history. There are many moments when political pressure can be a good thing. I don't mean to always say it's a bad thing. I don't come down in a normative statement about if it's good or bad, but I don't think the stories always show it's bad. Keating, I still don't think it was in the end the best way to conduct the debate. I can see that point of view. I'm not quite convinced of kind of where Keating was getting his information, and obviously if he was just getting it from Cuban informants who were not reliable, which Kennedy said he might have been right, but he could easily have been wrong, and he could have stirred up a very dangerous atmosphere through those. Is that why?
Like curveball.
Right. Like curveball. Okay, i.e. curveball, right. No, exactly. But look, there's other times, I mean, Johnson, the classic tension is, it's very clear in early Johnson, 64 and 65, the same fears I talked about with Kennedy were very important to how some of his nerves about withdrawal proposals that he was hearing from many different sources. He was very concerned about the what Republicans would make of any perception that Johnson is being weak in this area. And he's constantly talking about 1952 and what happened then and if it's going to happen again. He's very concerned with how making the wrong move before the war escalated into what it did. And that's important to remember in those early years, how it undercut him on domestic policy. And he's worried, and I think he meant it, that in fact Republicans would be much more dangerous on this issue. So it was better for him to avoid any decision that could undercut him, even if that meant being tougher on Vietnam than he should be, because he's safer in the White House than a Barry Goldwater who's going to start a nuclear war. But you can argue that those political pressures led him into a bad decision. Whereas there were other pressures, though, a few years later from the Democratic left, from Congress people like Senator Fulbright. Those were very real political pressures, and you could argue he was listening to the wrong ones. But that those pressures famously could have been very valuable had he responded to them. Then there's all these arguments about information, which are hard. I mean, the problem is the politicians are so fast and loose with the information that on the one hand you could say, well, it's like an intellectual seminar, that if you debate over the facts and you debate over the issues, ultimately we get closer to what the best answer is. But here we're talking about a different set of policies and a willingness of politicians to be very loose. I mean, I think you can criticize Democrats in the late 50s with these missile gap arguments, where there was a lot of questions and evidence it just wasn't true, what they were saying. And it did lead to a very kind of heightened, frenzied atmosphere in the same way McCarthyite arguments did in the early 1950s, this time over Cold War spending. And you could argue the same with Iraq now and curveball and the same kind of argument. So I come down with a yes and no on how the pressures work in different ways. Really depends on the story, depends on the moment. It also depends on how politicians answer it. But you can see beneficial moments where the politics can be okay. I'm sorry, I'm going to interrupt. Okay. Another moment, kind of, which is interesting, is Reagan, and what was very clear in the early part of I have an earlier chapter on Reagan, is that Reagan once he's in office, he's quite frustrated. And some of his decisions to back away from a more hawkish posture, some of it results from all the events in 1983 that lead him to think nuclear war is possible, the stuff Beth Fisher has written about. Some of it's political, though. I mean, the House Democrats are really going after him. The Boland amendments, in his mind, are extraordinarily frustrating, but a sign not of that the Congress is going to really limit what he can do. There's a lot of concern, Reagan, in the early 80s, which I was totally surprised with the nuclear freeze movement, which administration officials were not seen as this fringe kind of marginal group. They were very nervous about its impact on public opinion. They were aware that it had a lot of support among House Democrats that was growing after 1982. When movies come out like The Day After, they kind of instantly connect this, and it's a problem. And they see that Reagan the Hawk is a problem, and they talk about James Baker has some great memos in the Princeton archives where he's saying you need to change course before 1984 because you're out of step. The public doesn't support the Central America Initiative. I mean, it's very minimal for any kind of intervention there. And so you can tell a story where the politics pushes Reagan very far from where he had been in 1981 and moves him closer to where he's going to need to be in 1986 and 87 when Gorbachev emerges and this opportunity emerges. A moment when many conservatives were furious with Reagan, where it's saying he's a dupe of the Kremlin, that he is Neville Chamberlain all over again. When Dan Quayle is trying to subvert INF in 1988, I think the politics had helped move Reagan just like the crises did. And there you can argue it had a benefit. It allowed him to be a statesman in some ways, or it pushed him to be a statesman. Sorry.
Very quickly, you know what Reagan, I'll beg Jack's indulgence. When the INF Treaty was signed, Reagan sent a telegram to the director of the film The Day After, which said, "Don't imagine that your film had nothing to do with this because it did." Ronald Reagan.
I never saw that. That's interesting.
Go ahead, Jack.
One year that hasn't been brought up is 1956, and I'm wondering in your research whether Suez and Hungary developed gradually enough before they erupted onto the public consciousness that the Republican and Democratic sides could devise a strategy for their public pronouncements regarding these issues, or whether Eisenhower was pretty much left on his own to act as commander-in-chief in the run-up to the November election against Stevenson. Can you give us a little preview as to what your book has to say about that crisis period?
Well, I mean, I wouldn't say it's determinative for Eisenhower's victory, for sure. I mean, I think he was doing okay. I mean, in terms of his popularity, in terms of where public opinion was, that while those events that happened right up to the election and clearly are seen within the Eisenhower administration as favorable, even though they're crises, the perception was that would help a president in the months before the election. I don't think they ultimately shape the outcome of the election. I think they play into both crises with Eastern Europe too, that they play into perceptions that had been well crafted already for the administration and only strengthen a strong hand. And so that's very important. The kind of political back and forth that you see with the Cuban Missile Crisis, I don't think were as pertinent to Eisenhower in that month, in October and November, as he's tried to wrestle with this. Again, I kind of stopped short of, I couldn't, in a book like this, go deep into the policy-making decision with Suez. I was looking at how it affected kind of that political moment. But my impression was, because of his strength in 1956 and Stevenson's weakness, it doesn't have a huge political effect, besides amplifying where that election was going already.
Sir, your point about Eisenhower knowing that the missile gap was bunk brought up a point that I guess as I'm a career Army officer, so a national security bureaucrat would be curious about. Do you think there are any security decisions, no matter how trivial, that both political parties, the media, and the American public can ever look at the military intelligence diplomatic professional on the ground and say, all right, this guy knows what he's talking about, we're going to back his decision. A modern example being the fact that General Petraeus wants to close Guantanamo, but you've got numerous people on the political right who still think Guantanamo is the greatest thing on earth.
So you're asking to make first. I like being called sir, but just so I understand, are you kind of arguing? Can you, when you have good information, is it possible in our political process to get beyond the other kinds of arguments that you have?
Not so much that, but more really kind of divorced from the politics. You know, get Republican, Democrat leadership in the ground, and a serving general looks at them and says, "Look, I've been there, I've seen it. This is the best way to go."
Absolutely. I mean, look, in the end, the other thing I don't want to argue in this book is that politics always shapes national security decisions. I think politics is always there, and sometimes decisions are made. Vandenberg and Truman make some pretty significant strategic decisions with the Marshall Plan, with the whole national security apparatus that have kind of genuine strategic rationales. They're taking place in this heated environment. Truman's a politician, and he's thinking about the politics as Vandenberg is, but they could still make decisions that are not political. I do think Kennedy does that a bit here, but it's a challenge. Let me say it that way. The Guantanamo is one argument. Another argument that some make is the civilian trials of 9/11 people. I mean, some argue there's one going on right now in New York. And you don't know that from the debates. There's actually an ongoing one as we speak of an al-Qaeda figure, and you couldn't get that from the information. So I still don't think, though, in the end, all political leaders are kind of so politically driven that at moments they can't reach good decisions based on information. Look, another again, going back to Reagan. I mean, I came away with Reagan in those few years with a kind of a good impression. The first part of the story is how he got there, but the second is how he stayed there in 86 and 87 when it wasn't automatically the thing to do as a Republican in that period if you wanted to kind of maintain the support of your party in that final year. And yet, he came back to the fact that he thought that was the decision, and a good one, that the United States could make. Another kind of total flip, which is interesting. This isn't exactly related. I have a chapter on the Clinton in 95 and 96 and the Oklahoma City bombing. And then the parties are totally flipped from where they will be after 9/11, which I don't know. Clinton proposes a sweeping counterterrorism program after Oklahoma City, including something called roving wiretaps, where agents can tap multiple phones used by one person just with one court approval, chemical taggants so they could trace chemicals used. And who were the lead opponents? On the one hand, you had civil libertarians, and on the other hand, you had Bob Barr and a group of about 40 House Republicans who were saying this is a kind of crazy extension of government. You can't have the government do this kind of stuff. And then obviously, Barr is a lone voice after 9/11, and the Republican Party totally flips. And so you have information debates, you have total flips by the parties, where you can't imagine where they were a few years later. But still good decisions, I do think, can be made. I think what makes for great policymakers is not just being able to understand what the best decisions are and what the best advice is, but it's also being able to survive and make those decisions in a heated political context. I think that's important, and that's part of what I want to kind of at least suggest.
So we have time for one or two more, not a ton, but we have please, Chris.
I haven't read your book, but I saw the title and I was instantly brought to mind what I hear from generals and ambassadors today about using the full arsenal of democracy, development, defense, and diplomacy, the 3 Ds.
Yeah.
But in reality, when it comes time to fund the State Department or USAID or defense, politics becomes a major issue.
Yeah.
Do you touch on that at all, and
No, that's another book. My book, it's a great question. I mean, I do touch on, then the early part of my book is kind of these two competing visions for national security. One, liberal internationalism, which includes kind of much more robust approach to national security, including diplomacy and foreign aid and foreign assistance, and then a conservative internationalism, which I argue a group of Republicans promotes, that cuts away some of that and focuses much more narrowly on how this issue should be done. And I kind of talk about what happens to liberal internationalism and how this alternative conservative philosophy is more triumphant and cuts away at some of the programs. On kind of appropriations and spending, I mean, that's a great question. I'm really focused on kind of electoral politics, good old-fashioned partisan politics and elections, and how that plays into the mix. I do have stuff on the defense budget, and another big change, back to Josh's question, is obviously the defection of the South from the Democrats to the Republican Party. That's where a lot of military spending was, and that's kind of, you can trace the hawkishness a bit through the shift and migration of the South to the Republican Party. But I couldn't get into kind of appropriations battles, between state and the Pentagon. It's a great issue. I mean, I think that could be another book for someone who wants to say. There's some political scientists who've done a little on that, but the history of Congress in general is very limited. And I think, my hope with this book, it's really to be a conversation starter as much as the whole shebang. Even though this is kind of everyone knows that politics and national security have mixed, but there's very limited history of this. It's really remarkable. I mean, there's various reasons for it. I don't want to bore you, but one is the kind of nostalgia that then shapes the historical literature. So you downplay how this has happened before, so people haven't written about it. One is the divorce between diplomatic and political history, which has been really remarkable since the 1970s. So political historians have primarily, Bat's an exception, Ira Katz-Nelson's written a lot, but most have not written about national security, foreign policy questions. They've been in welfare, taxation, civil rights, and diplomatic historians kind of moved away from a concern about politics, which in the 60s and 70s they still were writing about it. But then they really focused on just State Department and interaction of foreign leaders and trying to resolve tensions between the great powers. And most recently, you've had this trend of the internationalization of diplomatic history, where the kind of trend is to not study anything within one country and really understand transnational phenomena. But the politics and this have been limited. Fred Logevall, I don't know if he spoke here recently, might have. He told me he was getting on a plane to Austin, so I realized he might have. He just wrote a book on the Cold War and politics, and there's a couple others. But my hope is this opens up kind of other issues and other books on subjects like that. But there's a whole field you can write about with this, which I think is hugely significant at this point and needs to be studied.
Wow. Okay, we'll take one more question. That sounded like a resounding call. We'll have one more question.
Too long, but wondering if you read The Best and the Brightest by David Halberstam.
Yeah.
If there's anything in there that you came away from really disagreeing with in a serious way.
For me, I have this chapter on Johnson where, again, as I said already, I do in the end conclude that politics was quite important to his decisions in 64 and 65. And the kind of same skill, the same amazing sensibility he had on domestic issues led him in the wrong direction on Vietnam. That said, Halberstam treats his political fears almost as irrational. Johnson couldn't see, obviously, that there was no threat from the Republicans. That's kind of it's part of the argument. There's many arguments in The Best and the Brightest, but I'm honing in on this one. And I see where Johnson came from. I mean, I think when you recover the 1950s and you recover the strength of kind of a conservative Republican national security argument, it was something very serious that Johnson did have reason to fear. It wasn't so crazy in 1964, or even after the landslide election, to think the Republicans could really undercut him on these issues. And I still think Halberstam kind of couldn't understand or wanted to downplay Johnson's fears. And I think, this was a guy, again, who lived through those 1952 elections, who lived through the fall of China to communism arguments, who had seen what people like Nixon could do when armed with these kind of questions. And while in the end I think Johnson made the wrong decision, I don't think he made a totally irrational political decision. And I have tons of stuff. I mean, this is the issue Goldwater is making major, but so are many other Republicans, even moderates. Really going after national security is the key thing. And you have to understand the 1950s to get where Johnson came from. And so on that issue, I'm different, very different, I think, than the tone Halberstam came down on.
Great. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
All right.